We're about to get started. Thank you everyone for coming. Merci à tout le monde d'être venu ce soir. I'm going to start, first of all, by announcing that there is translation into French for tonight's presentation. Il y a de la traduction vers le français pour ceux qui auraient besoin. Si vous avez besoin de la traduction vers le français, simplement allez vers l'arrière de la salle, à la personne là avec sa main dans l'air. Et la traduction chacun vers le français. Okay. So, we're going to begin. My name is Christina Sigus. I work at Cooper Concordia, and I'm going to be co-facilitating this with Zoe on the board at Federici. And tonight's event is organized by Cooper Concordia, Cooper McGill, as well as Chris Plebedev. Cooper Concordia and Cooper McGill are both the acronyms of an organization that stands for the Quebec Public Interest Research Group, Concordia and McGill, which are social justice organization or groups on campus, on both respective campuses, that work on various social and environmental justice issues and through anti-oppressive politics for the most, well, entirely, in promoting that form of activism. Chris Plebedev is a radical Montreal-based publisher and distributor. And the three of them have worked together to bring Silvia Federici to speak to us tonight in terms of a book launch for her newest book. So actually I'm going to, and also I should mention as well that the event tonight is being live streamed by CUTV, their camera's over there. We have a couple of announcements before we begin. So I'll give the floor first to Andrea, who will be making us a quick announcement about Cooper McGill.
Hello everyone. Cooper McGill is having our annual general meeting on Monday at 5 p.m. and you should all come. We're going to have food. We're going to tell you all about what we did this last year. We're going to have board elections. You're a member if you're a McGill student or you've been participating in one of our working groups or volunteering with Cooper in the last year. It's going to be really fun. You should all come. It's at 5 p.m. in the Lev Buckman room, the SMU building. That's 3486 McTavish. Metro McGill or BL. Also, they're just recorded and not live streaming.
Oh, thank you for that correction.
If you have any questions about the AGM, you can go on our website, coopermcgill.org, and there's more information about like the agenda, also what we're going to be doing, and everything else.
Thank you, Andrea. There's also going to be a quick announcement by Jackie.
Hey everyone. So the next event that both Cooper Concordia and Cooper McGill are putting on is a teach-in this coming Sunday. It's a teach-in on the theme of work. It's organized by CLAC, the Anti-Capitalist Convergence, which is a working group of Cooper Concordia. So there'll be 9 workshops in all on topics like immigrant workers in Montreal, an immigrant history of May Day. There'll be a workshop on self-management in the workplace, turning students into workers, a critical view of that. That's all happening on Sunday at SEDA, which is a community center near Maxwellino Group. Importantly, Sylvia will be speaking there as well on something different. So the topic of Sylvia's presentation at the teach-in will be reproductive work and the construction of the commons in an era of primitive accumulation. Relating to what's being talked about today, of course, but a different talk, and that's at 10 a.m. At the beginning of the day. So check it out, there's a poster and some flyers outside. And the other announcement I have is that both PERCs, Cooper McGill and Cooper Concordia, are endorsing a demonstration that's happening tomorrow. It's a civil disobedience organized also by the CLAC against P6, which is the bylaw being used to mass arrest people and ticket them. There'll likely be also a lot of signs there of the Montreal police spokesperson with a bullet in his head, because that photo was what was used to arrest somebody yesterday, and on the pretext that that was improper to take a photo of that graffiti. So all in all, there's an opportunity tomorrow to take to the streets. There's a possibility of arrest, as we all know, but there's an open call for demonstration. It's at 6 at Metro Berry UQAM. So come out if you can, spread the word. It'd be great to have a huge turnout for that.
One final quick announcement. I just want to say that Chris Plebedev is also has both the book that we are doing a book launch for tonight called Revolution at Point Zero, as well as Caliban and the Witch at a reduced rate for the event tonight. So if you want to pick up one of the two books now, it'd be a good time, and it's at the table just outside of the event.
So, I'm going to start by introducing our speaker tonight. So we have Federici. I'm going to read this because so Silvia Federici is a feminist activist, writer, and a teacher. In 1972, she was one of the co-founders of the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the International Campaign for Wages for Housework. From 1987 to 2005, she taught international studies, women's studies, and political philosophy courses at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. She has written books and essays on philosophy and feminist theory, women's history, education and culture, and more. Recently, the worldwide struggle against capital globalization and for a feminist reconstruction of the commons.
And tonight's event is a book launch of Sylvia's newest work, which is titled Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, which is a collection of essays representing 30 years of research and theorizing on questions of social reproduction and the transformations which the globalization process has produced. And so if we can all give a warm welcome to Sylvia Federici.
Good evening, and thank you first of all to people and Jackie and Carl in particular for having brought me here. And I want to tell you first of all how excited I am. I came about a year ago, more or less at the same time. It was, I think, when the strike was beginning. But I want to say that the strike has kept us warm through all these years. This has been one of the few victorious that we have had, certainly in this continent over this last time. So it's been very, very important, this starting today. And I can tell you that in New York, where I come from, people have been wearing the red patch, are still wearing that, and it has been a presence in every meeting that we have had. So I'm very honored to be with you tonight. As you know, I'm sorry I don't remember your name.
Christina.
And Christina mentioned, this book collects many, many years of work on the question of reproduction. And I want to start introducing it by saying something about the title. Why Revolution at Point Zero? What does it mean? And I want to say, first of all, that I took the title from the book of an Egyptian writer, Nawal el-Saadawi. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with her. If you're not, you should be, and you should go out and get Woman at Point Zero, because it's a book that is very, very powerful, and I'm sure that will be very thought-provoking and moving. Woman at Point Zero is a story of a woman who is speaking about her life, just waiting for execution. And in that sense, her life is the point zero. Point zero is the moment of complete crisis, when the moment when all illusions are gone, all hopes are gone. And the story of this woman is a story of many attempts to free herself, to gain some control over her life. And each of these attempts fails. And she, in a sense, looked at execution. The execution is symbolic. She refuses to ask for grace, and it's very symbolic, this refusal, and of exiting from this world, of the fact that she has recognized that there cannot really be justice for women, justice for people in this world. So a refusal to ask for grace, in a way, it's a provocation. It's a challenge to an unjust world. And this is why I took this title. Because I think that reproduction, in a way, it's the place, more today than ever, in which we meet the deepest crisis in our life. It's the moment and the process in which we confront, the most painful challenges in our everyday life. The lack of food, the inability to pay our bills, the work that never ends, the love affairs that break up, the pains coming in our relationship with people in a society that is so alienating. And at the same time, it is also the place where we can begin to reconstruct our life. I think it was a very, very important contribution of the women's movement to recognize that the whole sphere of activities that we speak of under the name of reproduction, it's a sphere that is not a sphere that is private, individual, personal, but in fact has a great political significance. And because it is also the sphere of activities that not only reproduces our life, but in capitalism has been subordinated to the reproduction of the workforce. So it is a sphere of activity where we continuously are also confronting power relations, and we are confronting our relationship with the state. In fact, a Canadian woman, Bo Watson, in the 1970s, made a beautiful song. She made a whole series of beautiful songs on the question of reproduction and housework. And one of them was called The State in the Bedroom. And the crisis, in fact, that you encounter in the everyday, when you cannot even pay the electricity to use your vibrator, so to speak. And so the state really enters your bedroom in the most intimate ways. So this is the way in which the way I think when I refer to reproduction, a revolution at point zero. In other words, the place where we can begin in a way to reclaim the control in our life, change our immediate relationship with other people, and the process in which we reproduce ourselves, certainly not individually, but collectively. This is something that, again, is not an individual process, but something that has to be part of a broader cooperation. Now, a few more words about what reproduction is. What is this? Because in the book itself, the concept of reproduction changes. And in fact, the book consists of 3 parts, and I'm going to sketch briefly, the content of each, spending a bit more time on the last part, but highlighting also the way in which the idea of reproduction is transformed in that process. In the first section, reproduction is really understood mostly as domestic work, as all that sphere of activity, as I was mentioning before, by which we are reproduced on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time, we also produce our capacity to work. And this is a work, of course, that women have done in capitalist society, has been women's labor in quote. And this is a work that has been traditionally very devalued. And so in the 70s, when I joined the feminist movement, I joined an organization called Wages for Housework. In fact, some of the first meetings that we had were also in Montreal. There were, in fact, groups, Wages for Housework groups in Montreal. And we campaigned, in fact, for Wages for Housework because we believed that the kind of devaluation and the kind of invisibility that this work has had in capitalist society has been very much at the center, at the roots of the devaluation of women, of the social position of women, and also has been at the roots of the devaluation that labor in general has suffered in this society. Not to mention the divisions that it has generated between women and men. So the first part of the book is very much concerned with materials, essays, articles, that in a way were trying to promote this perspective, which was not a perspective very welcome to most feminists, who through the 70s believed, and after, that the road to emancipation for women, in fact, was through wage labor, was through joining basically the wage working class, and saw the effort that we were making around the question of housework as basically a attempt or something that would be doomed to institutionalize women in the home and to basically confirm the kind of division and the kind of specialization that have characterized the sexual division of labor in capitalism. So the first part of the book is really very much a series of arguments, basically with feminists, with the left, to explain what is this work, what is really what we call housework, domestic labor. You know, the fact that this is not, again, a sphere of personal relation, but rather it's a process of production. It is something, it is part of the assembly line by which, in a capitalist society, the organization of work is created. You know, it's the antechamber to the factories, to the offices, to the schools, because in the homes you really produce the workers, the students, etc., etc. Students are workers too, by the way. But this is the part that I'm not going to insist upon. Maybe in the discussion we can return to it. In a sense, this conception of reproduction is a more narrow conception. At the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, you know, when in a certain way the women's movement had begun to decline as a mass movement, and more than began to decline, in fact, it was becoming the target of a massive intervention, you know, by the United Nations, by governments, you know, which tried to domesticate it, tried to co-opt it, and basically to channel the energies the women's movement had produced, you know, into becoming a support to the neoliberal agenda. You know, at that time, I also had, for the whole set of coincidences, the fortune of spending a few years in Nigeria. And that experience really changed my perspective, politically in general, but also on the question of reproduction. And when you look at the essay of the second part of the book, you can actually see the transformation that is expressed in that respect. Why? When I went to Nigeria in the 1980s, in the early 80s, two things happened. First of all, I went to an area of Nigeria that was the capital, the center of the oil industry. And that by itself was a major eye-opening, because the oil industry is an immense land expropriator, and it's an immense polluter, an immense contaminator. I lived for 3 years in an area that was at the center of the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is probably one, or was once, one of the earthly paradise was probably one of the most beautiful and life-enhancing areas in the world, because the land is extremely fertile. In fact, according to some theories, most Africans, Africa itself was populated from this massive migration coming from the delta due to the fact that the land there has been so fertile that has been able to support a broad population. And then at the same time, the delta is myriads of little creeks, rivers. Before the Niger goes into the ocean, it produces an infinity of channels, canals, rivulets that are, in the past, they were so rich that I was told that you could simply put your head into the water and the fish would jump to you. Well, when I was there, we had to buy frozen fish coming from other parts of the country because everything was so polluted that it was impossible to eat. So that experience was very moving, very educational, because I understood what these big energy companies are about and what this energy industry is about in terms of the land expropriation and also in terms of the social relation that they create. They seem something similar, very similar. It's also with the nuclear industry, which I think is very appropriate we talk about today, but I'll come back to it later. These are not simply commodity-producing outfit. They also generate a whole system of relationship, and that was very visible. At the same time, in the early 80s in Nigeria, I could see the beginning of what later was called the process of globalization. I arrived in 1984, early 84, when the country was actually debating where or not to take and loan from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, because the country was going through the so-called debt crisis. And we can talk about why so-called. I would say that those crises were artificially created. And, but in order to remedy their economic situation, the World Bank, the IMF were coming down on countries like Nigeria and many others in Africa, Latin America, Asia, with programs which eventually, in their combination, right, were really instrumental to restructuring the world economy. So among these programs were at the center of them were a whole set of changes having to do with the relationship to the land. One of the discoveries I made there was that, and this was really a very important discovery in my political outlook, was that in Nigeria, as in most of Africa, there still was a tremendous amount of communal land. In other words, of land held under the customary tenure system, which means that you are born into land. Basically the land is not privately owned, but it's a common, right? Certainly not the kind of commons that existed originally in Africa before colonialism. Colonialism had a big impact on this communal land system, but nevertheless, this communal system still contributed, and I could see the difference it made in people's life. I began to have all this discussion, with my colleagues. I was teaching at the university, and I had a lot of discussion with women in particular that really had a profound impact on me, and particularly on the question of reproduction. Like they would say to me, "You don't have any land? How come you don't have any land?" And I say, "No, of course I don't have any land." And they would say, "And how do you live? I live on my wages when I find them. And don't you feel anxious? I'll be terrified. They would say, I'll be terrified if I didn't have some land. If I didn't know that behind my job there is a village that I can turn to if anything happens, if I lose my job. Slowly I realized the issue of land had never been part of my political horizon. I've never been part I've always, the struggle had always been around the wage workplace or the unwaged workplace. The home, housework, reproduction, domestic labor, and the fact, and what it meant that this work was unwaged. These had been the parameters in which my political work had been organized. And what I discovered when I was in Nigeria was the question of land and what land meant. It meant, for example, that if we had a strike, my colleagues could go home to the village and bring back some food, even if we were not paid. It meant that whatever they thought may happen, pension or no pension, retirement or no retirement, or if they had an accident, they didn't feel the desperation that we would feel, knowing that we have no income. And they would be able to think, well, there's a village back there. And so the question, but I arrived at the very moment in which not only in Nigeria, but in Africa and across the world, in a way, we were beginning to witness the biggest drive of land expropriation yet, I think, on this planet. Something that, in a way, it's had proportions, speaking about Africa, you know, even broader than the kind of expropriation that took place in the colonial period. In fact, you could say that what is happening today, especially in Africa, it's really the most dramatic, extensive attack on land that has occurred in the history of the continent. Now, why this attack of land? And what has this attack that began in the early 80s and has continued actually escalating and is not confined to Nigeria, but actually is an attack that you also find in Latin America, in the United States, in Canada. And why this attack on land? Where is it coming from? What kind of impact it has also on the life of people? You know, here I think we can go back to Marx, volume 1 of Capital, and revisit, you know, the chapter in which Marx speaks of primitive accumulation and the fact that in order for capitalism to set up, for capitalism to develop, one of the things that the capitalist class had to do, the nascent capitalist class had to do, was to expropriate people from the lands that they had used and they had been able to rely upon for their survival. And this was the centerpiece, the first step that capitalism had to take in order to set up its system. Well, what we have been witnessing through the 80s and up to today, because the process is still ongoing and expanding, it's really a rerun of primitive accumulation. In fact, we have discovered that primitive accumulation is not a process that is confined to the early phase of capitalism, but is a process that has continued, you know, because the act of expropriating people from the land, and land is not just land. Land means seas, coastlines, fisheries, ponds, forests, sources of fuels, and so forth, right? The act of expropriating people from the most basic sources of their reproduction, right? It's an act that is foundational, but foundational in the sense that it is continuously renewed every time the capitalist class is in crisis. And so that we begin to understand that this new drive of land expropriations that I began to witness in Nigeria in the 80s, right, in a sense represent part of a broad response, you know, to a whole cycle of struggles that took place, culminating in the 60s and 70s. Anti-colonial struggle, feminist struggle, blue-collar struggle, Native American people struggles, right? That in a way, by the 70s, were shaking up the foundation of the capitalist system. And the response of the system has been, which has been the classic response of capitalism to all of its crises, right? To basically expand immensely the world labor market, throw millions and millions of people, actually 2 billion people in this case, right? Expropriate people, take them away, displace them from their job, from their land in particular, and in that sense, restore the power relationship, right? Regain the initiative, regain a different balance in the power relations. So this is what I began to observe in Nigeria, but of course, over the years I've been much more interested in this question of land, and I've been continuously trying to understand, you know, the new forms that it's taking. And clearly, the expropriation takes place not only by, you know, forcible eviction. It takes place also by ecological contamination, ecological disasters, right? By the use of a reckless use of technology that, as in the case of the oil company or the nuclear company, makes vast areas of the world uninhabitable and therefore out of the boundaries, out of the possibility for people to use them, you know, for their livelihood. Today, Africa is the center of one of the largest land grabs in the history of the continent. And now it's a concerted land grab. You have mining company, and by the way, Canadian mining companies are among the leading. We have agro-fuel, agribusiness, and then we have a whole set of governments who now are buying land. Saudi Arabia is buying land in Ethiopia, India is buying big swaths of land all over Africa, Brazil is relocating thousands of people in Mozambique, and we are speaking just of the African continent. Much of the same could also be said. In the United States, there is now a drive to expropriate Native American people from their land. There's all kinds of complicities, very similar to the complicities that are taking place in Africa between the local chiefs and the companies, the mining companies or the agribusiness company and the local governments to basically expropriate people. So that the classic experience nowadays, if you are in an African village or if you are on an Indian reservation in the United States, is to see the engineers arriving, generally followed by the military or by the police, and saying, you have to move because we have to start the drilling. We have to start the excavation. And you know, these businesses don't like to waste any time. And this is documentable, and you can find it in many places. Okay, so in relation to this process, which really has a double aim. On one side, it wants to put an end to communal land ownership. Right? It wants to basically privatize land, turn it into a market, make it available to corporations, right? but it also wants to eliminate subsistence economies. One of the aims of the World Bank in Africa today is certainly to put an end to another type of agriculture, which is part of the communal land system, but is particularly identified with women, which is subsistence farming. It's the cultivation of the small patches of land in the common land or in any part of the environment that is available to women. Right? This subsistence agriculture has been extremely important to the survival of people, particularly in the 80s and 90s, when the liberalization of these economies, particularly the program of structural adjustment that was imposed by the late 80s. Structural adjustment, you probably know what that involves, right? It's basically a program that the World Bank has sold to government all over the world that basically adjusts the economies by telling the state to withdraw from any form of support of the reproduction of the population. So structural adjustment means cuts in education, cuts in healthcare, cuts to transport, to public transport. So structural adjustment, and also it means massive devaluation of the currencies. So structural adjustment has actually impoverished immensely millions of people. In that context, subsistence agriculture has made often the difference between life and death for many people. And when the World Bank comes in and attacks subsistence agriculture, and for example, attempts to, as they have done, to establish, convince government that to introduce land reform, whereby land is now transferred, from the common to the individual, where commons are supposed to break up, and individual land titles are given. When that occurs, immediately subsistence agriculture is jeopardized, and this is very much a terrible attack of people's capacity to reproduce themselves, particularly women, who in places like Africa, for instance, are 90% of those subsistence farmers who are engaged in subsistence farming. So I say this because I've been very interested in the question of the relationship between women and land, and particularly in the second part of the Revolution at Point Zero. This is one of the questions that I've looked at. And I've looked at what kind of struggle, how have women responded, or people in general, but women in particular, how have they responded to this very, very broad attack? And it's been extremely important to see that, in fact, the kind of initiatives that women have taken on the question of land farming and reproduction has been extremely crucial in changing the landscape of resistance. The landscape of resistance to globalization, and in particular to the kind of displacement that has been at the center of the restructuring of the world economy. I speak now in particular about Africa, about Latin America. I will want to make later on a connection also with what is happening, in this part of the world, because there's a very direct connection. But certainly, I say that throughout Africa and Latin America, in particular, which are the areas that I've been more familiar with, the main response to the liberalization of the world economy, to the kind of a mass attack that has been waged on people's forms of reproduction, on the means of reproduction, beginning with the land, but also continuing with the attack on employment, the attack on services, the attack on government support for all kinds of welfare programs, right? That the main response has really come, in many cases, from women who have begun to reoccupy some of the territories, some of the lands that have been taken away from them, and create more new communal forms of reproduction. For example, in Africa, women have begun all through the 80s and 90s to take over any piece of land, whether it is in a city, whether it is in the rural area. In fact, today, people speak of the development of a urban movement. Urban in the sense that there is a whole population of people that is continuously moving from the rural areas to the city and back, because they are trying in a way to eke out some form of existence, right, in both places, because none of them, neither area really allows them to support themselves completely. But at the same time, women in particular have been like the spearhead of a movement for land reclamation. And there are some land squatting, engagement in land struggles, and in particular the day-to-day capillary attempt to basically take over plots of land, deprivatize the land, and in this process they have also begun to break down the separation between town and country, right? The famous separation of rural and urban. So it has often been said, and I document some of that process in the second part of Revolution at Point Zero. It has been said that, for instance, African towns, in many cases, have been turned into gardens because all around, in the middle of the cities, you see peppers, you see cassava, you see little plots of land, in which all kinds of things are being cultivated. In Latin America, you have very similar processes. For example, in most Latin American capital cities, you have committees, urban gardening committees, dozens and dozens, who organize basically land takeovers and cultivate them. Also, you have all kinds of social commons. Women responding to the impoverishment, for example, by creating milk committees to guarantee a glass of milk every day to the children because it becomes so expensive that unless women come together, shop together, cook together, put their energies together, the family, the community will starve. And this has been one of the great developments that have taken place in recent years. I think I need a little bit of water. Very difficult to. If I see you can have, that's great. So this has been, by the way, there is an interesting, very important book by a Latin American writer, Uruguayan writer, Raúl Zibeki, probably some of you know of him, called Territories in Resistance, that outlines this initiative. And in fact, Zibeki himself, writes in this book that the women have been at the center of the social transformation that has taken place in recent years in response to this program. Now, I think it's important that we have this understanding, because I think that what is happening with us, here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, is very much related, to these developments that I'm describing. And I think there's a lot that we have to take into account and a lot that we can learn from the struggles that have been waged, in these parts of the world. What is that we can learn? First of all, that when we look at the restructuring of the world economy, what we see that what has really been most fundamental in the transformation of social relation, economic relation, political relation. Thanks a lot. And what has been most fundamental in the restructuring of power relation, right? The restructuring of power relation has not been technological innovation, has not been the arsenal of new technologies, the computer, the digital labor, the internet, and so forth, right? It's not been the technological leap, but rather it's been the capacity of the capitalist class to expropriate, displace a tremendous amount of people from the means of their reproduction, and in this way to expand immensely the pool of labor available for exploitation. I think that this is very important and very sobering. No computerization of work, and no computer restructuring, computer-based restructuring of the international division of labor would have been possible without that primary expropriation. Without that primary expropriation. This is important because it enables us to see, what is the significance of those policies, those initiatives that are in fact separating millions of people from their land. And also, what is the significance of the struggles that people are making across the world to hold on to the land, to the seas, to the forests, right? So we need to have a sense, because, and this is true for a number of reasons, but first of all, because we are connected to the struggles. We are connected to the struggle. And we are connected in many different ways. We are connected because, in a way, there is a direct relationship between the type of expropriation that many people are suffering, from the land and the fisheries and so on, and the expropriation that we are suffering, from wage employment, from social services, from space, from housing, and from just the social spaces, right? Today, in the United States, even the sidewalk are the matter of a struggle. You don't have a right to the sidewalk. Soon we will not have a right to the beaches. In Europe, in certain parts of Europe, still you have to struggle now to be able to find a patch in a beach in the summer to be able to go. This summer I was in Italy, there was a big debate in some tourist town as to whether a person had the right to walk in front of an hotel on the sand, or they would have to go into the sea because that area was private property. right? But this is a sign of the time. This is very much a sign of the time. The fact that, in fact, we are losing our relationship to space. We are losing our homes, continuously the escalation of rents. We are losing services, so there's a direct expropriation. I mean, when we see in a context, when we put the attack on lands, the attack on services, we see there's a policy. And that's very, very important to understand. There's now a concerted policy of basically creating a world population, a world workforce that cannot rely, that has no guarantees, they cannot rely on anything for its present and its future. Whether it is a piece of land, or whether it is a social service, or whether it is a home, or some medical care. And we can extend it even further. First of all. Second, our connection also has to do with the fact that our own everyday life, our own reproduction, is very much connected to those expropriations. This is not an issue of guilt tripping, because in many cases we have little choice, or we are not even aware, for example, that when we throw out the trash into the garbage every day, that trash may end into the common land, the expropriated former common land of some African group, some African community, right? Or they may end up on a barge, which then is sunk into the sea on some coast of, you name the country, as it is now the case. And this connection between what we wear, what we eat, how we dispose of our trash, and what happens, right, at the other end of the world, where the clothes that we wear are produced, where the food that we consume comes from, or the trees that go into the paper that we throw away so easily, are felled. This is something that we have to understand. We have to continuously realize, right? It's not, of course, a problem that we can deal individually, but it's a problem that has to become part and parcel of our everyday reproduction. We cannot think of creating commons, better forms of social cooperation, in Montreal or in New York or in Los Angeles, unless we also begin to deal, right? We begin to see what is the real cycle of our reproduction. What is the real cycle? What does it really include? Where does it start? Where does it end? How many dimensions it has? How are they interconnected? How our defeats are connected to the defeat of other people? Because I think it's only in that way that we can really begin to create a different political initiative on basically the relationship to our everyday life, right? So, okay, perhaps I will stop here. I wanted to continue, actually, or maybe I want to say that, because I really want to have a discussion, that I've tried, the last part of the book really deals with the question of the commons, and particularly looking at the issue of the commons from a feminist viewpoint, from the point of view of women's struggle. Because I think that some of the more interesting developments have occurred in this direction. And partially it's because women have been those most directly impacted by these developments. right? So when we speak of displacement, impoverishment, cut in services, we are not speaking of processes that are uniformly deployed, right? Obviously, there are different countries, different parts of the population are affected in different ways, right? But consistently, throughout the planet, women have been really at the center. And obviously, you cannot undermine the means of reproduction of the world workforce without attacking, disciplining, displacing those who have been the primary subject of reproductive work, which is women, and continue to be today, even if we have a second job. Right? And secondly, because the very fact that women have had less access to the monetary wealth, to monetary employment, to monetary forms of income, has made women much more dependent on access to the natural resources of the earth. Right? In other words, we're being much more dependent on having access, to land, on having access to fisheries, to forests, etc., at least on a global scale. So in that way, and because I mentioned before, women have been very much in the lead of the subsistence economies of the planet, all those areas. By the way, I do not include housework as a subsistence economy. Housework is unpaid labor. I mean subsistence economy, those economies where you still have access to some form of wealth, right? Even if it is a little patch of land. So, because women have been the ones who have resisted some access to subsistence, they have also been at the center of the target of these international organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, and so forth. Right? So, the question of the commons for us, it's also beginning to understand how we relate ourselves to those targets. And I will stop here. Thank you so much.
However, I will say, let's try to keep the rather long and rambling comments to a minimum and try to be as concise as possible so that we can allow everybody an opportunity to speak. Does anybody have any questions? Comments?
It's a really small one. You mentioned you were going to say something when you were speaking about energy, about nuclear energy as well, and I'd like to hear what you were going to say about that.
Right, I know it's yes. Yeah, nuclear energy, after Fukushima, after the disaster of Fukushima, a group of people, most people from Japan in New York, decided that it was scandalous that the media, the kind of blackout from the politicians, from the media, on the entity of the disaster, and that they have to do something, and they formed a group of which I'm part, and actually Adrian has been very much part of it, to publicize what is being taking place in Fukushima. And what has transpired has been extremely, extremely important. Not only because what it has revealed about the accident, and the role of the nuclear industry today, across the world, but also because of the similarities between the behavior of the nuclear industry and the behavior of the other type of industry, the financial world, the international economic agencies that represent collective capital. In each case, what transpires is that they do not care about our lives. They absolutely do not care about our lives. Fukushima has practically disappeared from the screens. Right? Our governments don't talk about it. And in Japan, the Japanese government says everything is fine. We are now ready for reconstruction. They have evacuated a very limited number of people from a small radio, I think about 12 miles from where the disaster is taking place. In reality, the disaster is immense. They have no idea even how to deal with it. Right? But fundamentally, they are still committed to continuing producing nuclear energy. The Japanese government is committed to reopen again the other reactors they have temporarily deactivated. And we have heard our president saying that, in fact, we have full support for the nuclear industry. In the United States, too. It has not made any sense, any difference. And the line that we are given is that our comfort depends on it. And after all, this is a society of risk. This is a society of risk, so you don't stop driving your car because you may have an accident. And therefore, why stop having nuclear industries, having nuclear plants? Because they might, in fact, explode and make the territory around for miles and miles and miles inhabitable forever. Right? So we see there is, in fact, a logic that is percolating from the nuclear industry and is also permeating political life today, which basically say that our lives are really disposable. That, in fact, there's no commitment to ensure that our well-being will be guaranteed, our well-being will be preserved, and that the prosperity of the nuclear industry takes priority over the lives of millions of people. So that the sense that no matter how disastrous, think of it, every day since the time of the explosion, right, tons and tons of water have gone to this reactor and then are poured into the ocean. Nobody's telling us as our waters have become more radioactive, they surely must have, right? Particularly when you consider that all the nuclear explosions that have already been made in the United States has done probably in the 50s about 100 nuclear explosions. Some underground, some above ground, right? Cesium, strontium, they have a half-life for 1,000 years, right? Where is the radioactivity? Where is it gone? All we know is that we have an epidemic of cancers. In the United States, I hardly know it. Almost every 2-3 months, we hear of another friend, another relative, another comrade who is coming down with cancer. But nevertheless, this is now being completely ignored. Right? And I think it's not to mention that I spoke before about the fact that these energy companies, like every other company, they are, technology is not a matter of material devices. Technology is a matter of relations. So when you have nuclear industry, nuclear plants, you have to militarize the territory. Right? Think of the kind of power that a nuclear plant puts in the hand of a local government. Right? You want to stop a strike? You want to stop mass movements? You say there is a plume of radioactivity that has escaped from the plant. Everybody home. Right? In other words, you can use the disaster or the threat of the disaster to actually regulate the movement of thousands and thousands of people. Just that should be a consideration, for us to say no to nuclear power. But then what's happened to Fukushima, I think it's even more threatening, which is to say, when this disaster happened, nothing really is done in any serious way to deal with our well-being. On the contrary, think of it. In fact, Yuko, this friend who is part of this group in New York, just came back from Japan, and she brought all kinds of images and a videotape, and she showed that now in the shops of Tokyo, they are selling love tomato. The love tomatoes are tomatoes that are produced in the area of Fukushima. And they're called love tomato because you are supposed to buy them to show your solidarity with the people of Fukushima. In fact, the Japanese government has asked every town, every area in Japan to take a certain amount of contaminated soil and spread it all over, with the idea that if you spread it, you actually show your solidarity to the people of Fukushima. That a little bit everybody takes a little bit, and the idea, if we all take a little bit, then the danger is diffused. Right? This is what is happening. And they are basically blackmailing people a lot, saying, oh, if you don't eat the product of Fukushima, you're not patriotic. Because if you don't do that, then people abroad will know that our produce is not good, and they will not buy, and the Japanese economy will go under. Now, this seems horrendous, but aren't our governments doing the same? Aren't the governments in Europe doing the same? Right? That the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Now they're saying that the Gulf is completely clean. The Gulf is a cornerstone. Even if they don't build the Keystone pipeline, which would be the coup de grace, that would be a complete coup de grace. But if they don't build the pipeline, it's already, because it turns out that even before the spill by British Petroleum, many companies that have been exploring had not tapped, basically they have not closed the holes that they had made in the drilling. And so petroleum had continuously come out. So this in a way tells us what is the nature of this capitalism that we are living in, and how crucial it is that whatever we do, we move in an horizon that think of an alternative.
There was somebody else, but then you'll be afterwards.
So I have a bunch of questions. The first is about, so we talked about commons and their ability to reproduce and how they're being attacked and expropriated by capitalism today. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the commons, or sorry, capitalism requiring these commons to help reproduce their labor to begin with. that necessarily forming a politics of defense of the commons might miss like a larger picture in terms of capitalism needing these to reproduce their workers, that they don't necessarily just act as a means of defense for the working class that will go back to the commons in terms of just strikes, but that they also produce the people who will go and work in factories in southern China, and because they have a hard time producing their own working class. So just to address that issue of capitalism kind of always requiring this commons that will produce their new working class. The other question is about about wages for housework, and I was wondering about the way that particular struggle can be kind of like institutionalized, and how it seems to be just almost like trying to expand the working class and allowing the state to further regulate women as workers. And from what I understand, there's been some kind of address to that as by I think yourself or some of your colleagues in terms of describing it as well. It gives women a greater position to refuse their labor once they're being paid for that wage labor. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's still really something that's confusing for me to understand, and how that responds to the contemporary society now, where we see $7 a day daycare. We see almost kind of like capitalism having responded to that struggle and that demand for wages for housework, and that we have nannies now that are afforded by the working class. We have daycares, we have fast food restaurants that will be...
We actually don't have, but that's okay. But then, yeah.
Well, I mean, here we $7 a day daycare to the percentage that had been before. Yeah, so I guess if we could address just some...
Maybe we can take another one, then I thought...
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, at the end of the introduction in Revolution 2.0, you briefly mentioned that sort of in looking at the current moment, you might reconsider what the wages for housework campaign would mean for now, for the current moment. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that thought process.
Some other question?
You mentioned the time in Nigeria at the time that was significant British understanding for possible and land expropriation, and I was wondering if when you were there you also witnessed struggles and resistance. Well, you mentioned land squatting and all these things, but in the early phases, if you saw anything that was inspiring to you.
Okay, so the first question had to do with, there was a book in the 70s by a French anthropologist, Meillassoux. Some of you may have read it. Who basically looked at, it was a very interesting book. I have a lot of respect for Meillassoux. He spoke about the fact that this village, like the African village that I was presenting in these very positive terms, that actually I think he was referring particularly to South Africa, that in fact these were places that helped reproduce cheap labor for the urban areas, right? So that in a way the village was less of the alternative to capitalism, but was more the avenue to the production of cheap labor. Perhaps in some parts of Africa, in some parts of the world, that may be the case. But actually, in my experience, and the experience that of the struggles and the interventions that have taken place through the 80s and 90s to today, I would have to conclude that Meillassoux was not correct. Because actually, when I see the effort that the World Bank has made to decommunalize, to destroy those villages, to decommunalize those land relations, and the struggle that people have made. In fact, Africa is the last place where the World Bank has been able to have its way. And by the way, I haven't spoken about war, but war is an incredible means of displacing people from their lands. So for example, for a long time, you know, the World Bank tried to convince Africans to give up communal land ownership and take on individual title, and they've had very, very little success. This is why now land grabbing is so, land grabbing means violence. It means that they have to go with the army, with violent means to push people out. So when I see the intervention, I have to conclude that in fact, that no, I don't think that those villages, those communal land systems predominantly were basically undermining people's power and facilitating their absorption, you know, into very exploitative wage system. I don't know enough about China, though, to speak about that. So I don't know enough about the rural situation in China, right? In terms of wages for housework, well, I don't think that wages for housework would have institutionalized women in the home, because actually women were very institutionalized already. See, that's question of institutionalization. This is where we started from. Right? In other words, if you have no money, if you are in a situation in which your destiny is unpaid labor, is domestic work on an unpaid basis, you're already institutionalized. Not only in the home, but also in a relationship of dependence with people around you. And the question is that that work does not end when you take away job. We now have 40 years of experience. You know? Certainly in Europe, in the US, in Canada, the large majority of women have taken on wage jobs. So now we actually have something that we can discuss. No? Women have not ceased to do unpaid labor, except that now you have a tremendous crisis because in addition to a job outside the home, you also have to go back. And the fact that their work has been unpaid has also meant, for example, all the cuts in social services have been possible because they know there is going to be a woman at home. Cuts in elder care, cuts in child care, which is where I come from. You know, in the United States, this has been decimated. Cuts in hospital care. Now they send you home bleeding after an operation. Right? So in the past, all kinds of services, dialysis, putting a catheter in, were done by, you know, experts on a hospital basis. Now the companies, the medical companies, are creating instruments to teach the family members to carry on the same operation in the home. Right? So there's been a tremendous, tremendous amount of housework that has returned to the home. You know, there has. So, what is the situation today? People are absorbing back into the home all the work that is being expelled, you know, from the public sector, right? So that's what I think is very important. I said that I would not want today to go back to the problem that I saw, because I think the experience of the 90s, of the massive devaluations of currency that have taken place, where $1,000 overnight across the world became $5, right? The way money, understanding better the way money can be used to demobilize and also can be reduced. Today, the financial world has instruments, right, of moving money around, devaluing money, that can make any kind of monetary gain very fragile. So I'm not suggesting that we give up struggles over monetary income. I'm not suggesting that. But I think we now have to make struggles that begin to reclaim something that is, a different type of wealth. We need a different type of reclamation. And first of all, we also need struggle that deconstruct the social fabric which has been torn apart by the destruction of the world economy. Because it's not been only impoverishment, right? When you close down jobs or certain forms of employment, you also disrupt communities. Some of the weaknesses, political, social weaknesses that we experience in terms of building effective struggles have to do, the forms of organization that existed have been torn apart through economic restructuring of the workplace, gentrification, social spatial deconcentration, spatial deconcentration, when you actually reorganize the territory in such a way that a whole set of people are excluded from it, right? Today, our cities are not what they used to be 30 years ago. The kind of community network that existed are gone, right? So there's a whole set of reconstruction that has to take place. To me, when I speak of commons, I speak not only of a patch of land or a patch of forest or a material goods, but I speak a particular set of relationships and a perspective that has to guide our activities and our political initiative, which means building common interests, building a collective subjects, restoring a certain type, rebuilding communities. This is why I think the wages for household by itself, to me today, will not be sufficient. It's not that I have something against it, but I think it's definitely not enough. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about the role of different types of violence in this process of dispossession. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you were ever inclined to examine the role of prisons and police.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, well, I would say very much. I think it's central. For instance, there is a direct relationship between, the process of globalization, the restructuring of the world economy, right, and the rise of mass incarceration. So these are really processes that are all integrated. Mass incarceration, the return of the death penalty, not only in the United States, by the way, because the death penalty is not only returned in the United States. I mean, return has always been there, right? But then there was a moratorium in 1972, where the death penalty was basically suspended, not eliminated, suspended, because it was recognized to be administered unjustly. And then it was restored in the late 70s and has continuously escalated, right? Today, we have death penalty in the streets of the United States. Last week in New York, 2 weeks ago, they killed a young man, 17 years old. They say he was a gang member, right? 7 shot, 3 in the back. They left him die on the pavement, begging them, 17 years old, don't kill me. Please don't let me die. They let him die. They said he had pulled the gun. Witnesses say he did not. This is happening all the time. The use of tasers now, tasers gun, that's death penalty, that's execution in the street. You know, tasers gun have become now the arm of the police, and they put you into shock, they put you into convulsions, right? So, you know, we had more than 2 million people in jail, you know, mostly black youth, but also Hispanic youth, and so forth, right? So this has been very much part, right? You cannot expropriate masses of people from their means of subsistence. And I said, it does not affect people uniformly. Some are affected more than others. In Harlem, in certain parts of Harlem, for the last 20 years, you have had 50% unemployed. 50% unemployed. So there are large parts of the world in which people have nothing. And so you need jails, you need executions, and you need wars. So the violence has been constitutive, it's been very much constitutive of the globalization process of the world economy, you know, and war. We have now permanent warfare. Warfare is not permanent, right? You hardly go 6 months or a year, there's not a new country. Yeah, it's not a new country. So Libya, Syria, Mali, etc. You know, there is now a warfare that is percolating through the planet. It's a war machine that is, but the war is in our street. So I went to a demonstration a week ago on a Sunday in a protest for the killing of this young boy. 55 blocks. We walked 55 blocks. Not that the demonstration walked 55 blocks. The demonstration was actually very small. And you saw why. Because for 55 blocks that I walked, it was one long set of policemen. You know, somebody said, this looks like Christmas. Because the police cars, all the lights, there were so many lights that it was like Christmas time. It was like being in the middle of a Christmas tree. You know, and you had the big vans, then you had the smaller cars, then you had the motorcycles, then you had these other vehicles. I haven't understood yet what they are, but they are like this. Exactly. And so, yes. And then at the corner of the street, 3 cops here, 3 cops here, 3 cops here, at every corner, 55 blocks. So, this is, and the demonstrator must have been about 200. Right? So this was an occupation. This was an invasion. This was an occupation, right? It was a saying, you cannot move, don't move, because we'll destroy you. So there has to be a whole thinking. So absolutely, this is why we really need, very importantly, to think of perspective struggles that are beginning, first of all, to rebuild the strength from below, right? To rebuild those networks, those forms of organization, those forms of coordination. And I'll say the community level, because I think our community is a fiction now. You know, there's not really. There are some communities, but by and large, our cities have been decommunalized. So many people have been pushed out. You know, so many people have lost the ability to stay in the city with rent increases, with jailing, etc. So we need to think in terms of rebuilding those relations.
Yeah. It seems to me like a lot of what you discussed tonight revolves around the notion of basically like a concerted effort at making the workforce precarious in every way, to use this as kind of like an implicit threat to people at all times, so that you have flexible labor that's willing to sacrifice whatever basic needs that they would have for, you know, a dignified life and stuff like that. And that, like, the issue of the land as being like, and the land being a broad thing of access to basic resources and stuff like that, and primary resources and everything. But how do you, not that you can offer up the solution, but like, is it a return to the land thing that we're talking about here? Is it like deurbanization? Is it a mixed kind of approach that involves that, but also involves like something about the city in terms of like town hall type of democracy, direct democracy? Like, what is the global vision here of challenging these?
Let's see. I think the first thing I will try to say, and I don't know if I'm being particularly coherent, but I think the first thing I want to say is that I think perhaps I'm reacting in the way it's structured and to the fact that now there's a lot of talk about commons, at least in the West, but everywhere I go, people want to talk about the commons. And I'm taking it in a long way. Hopefully, I will not be lost on the road. And you know, I'm very excited about the talk of the commons, you know, for some of the reasons. And I know where the talk is coming from. You know, it's coming from the sense that we are being caged. We are being pushed out, you know, everywhere we turn. Right? Everywhere we turn now, there is a danger. I feel it in my life. I don't know if you feel it in your life. You know, and my life is a very comfortable life compared to the world scale. It's a very comfortable life. I eat every day. I had a roof over my head, etc., etc. However, nevertheless, even shopping, you know, I never know if what I buy is going to poison me. I never know if when I go to buy my fresh fish to this boat that comes to, you know, our neighborhood, you know, this is going to be full of radioactivity and cesium from Fukushima, you know, whether, you know, the soya, what is it called? Anyway, you know this thing. So one first thing I wanted to say is to say that when we speak of commons, alternative struggles, we really first have to begin to really see what is the context in which we are living and struggling. You know, what are the strategies? Because we are living in a very highly radioactive field, in a very highly antagonistic field today. And I am 71 years old. I have lived there quite a bit. I was born in World War II, in the middle of World War II, under planes that were bombing my family every night. And in the 2 months after the final solution had been declared, then people were beginning to be gassed. So I was not born under good stars. And I grew up with all the stories of World War II and what we suffered, etc., etc. But nevertheless, I feel very concerned for the future of the new generations, because the kind of forces I see in the field are extremely negative. So this is a call in a way not to be pessimistic, because pessimism doesn't help. It's a luxury. Pessimism is really a luxury. But it's a call to have a good understanding of what are the forces. I would say that the kind of attack that capitalism is waging on people across the world, which has so many fronts, and they're all connected, it's obviously a response to struggles that people are making. It's obviously a response, right? But it also means something. It means that this system cannot provide prosperity for all, cannot provide a well-being for all. You know, that it can only provide prosperity for a certain group of people, for a certain amount of time. And so in the 1960s and 70s, when we kind of saw a sort of world revolution, if you want, perhaps it's a bit exaggerated, but we saw so many people moving, right? The struggle against apartheid, the end of colonialism in many ways. You know, okay, neo-colonial, but still, big anti-colonial struggle. The women's movement, attacking the division of labor, attacking all these inequities. The system, the truth of the system was shown, right? That the reply of the system has been a massive, massive attack. As I said, expropriation, warfare, mass incarceration, restructuring of the organization of work, making everybody precarious, taking away social services, right? I think that we first need to learn that. I think we need to understand that. I think we need to understand the wars, the ecological spills, the disasters, the continuous, not as temporary crisis. Oh, there was the worst crisis, 2008. Oh, those corrupt financiers. No, it's not. Of course, they are corrupt. What else? but this is not a contingent crisis. So that we don't look at all these firecrackers, right? So, oh, there is a big crisis. Well, big transfer of public money into their hands, right? That whole show of the worst crisis was instrumental to a massive, massive transfer of money from our, funds to theirs. I think we need to understand that there is nothing contingent, right? But there's a particular organization which, over time, has a logic. And I think it's good to understand that logic, right? Because when you look at capitalism on the long period, not about 10 years, 15 years, you begin to see certain trends, like it's a system that is also a closed system. You can see repeated patterns of behavior. Crisis, expropriation. Crisis, war. Crisis, recolonization, right? You can see now. I think it's important to see that, because then you begin to understand, you begin to anticipate, right? You begin to say, oh, okay, this is the field, right? And in order to understand how to organize your resistance, how to organize your struggle, you need to understand what is the field. So, very modestly, one first objective of my presentation was not to make a list of horror, right? But was to establish a couple of things. One, capitalism is not viable. And we say that all the time. But I think when you say it to yourself, when it gets into your bones, that this system is a system that is destructive, then you begin to rethink of your life. I know this at least is what has happened to me and some of the people I work with. Then you begin to rethink. Yeah, you begin to say, well, how do I organize my life? Right? Two, the fact that it's important that we understand it's a machine. Right? They're not omnipotent. Right? They're not omnipotent. And there's a lot from history. History is our common. We have a common, it's history. While history has been a very divisive common too. Because we've been very much divided, right? But there's a lot we can learn from history. So this has been, and then when we think of commons, when we think of creating a more cooperative society, when we think of reclaiming the wealth that we have produced, and also reclaiming access to the natural wealth, right? When we think of that, we realize that we cannot just simply say, oh, let's set up this, oh, let's set up that. But we are working in a field which is already mined, right? Imagine that we are walking through mines. So we need to know where the mines are. We need to know where the mines are in order to be able, so not that we don't explode in the process of building our commons. So that, to me, was what I was trying to say. You know, for example, you know, I don't see the construction of commons today as something that is completely separate from other forms of struggle. So we have to begin to see how we connect the building of commons in a way that gives power to these other struggles and maybe changes these struggles too. So that defending you know, a public school, defending a public hospital, and creating health commons are not two different projects. But that we can think of those two struggles together. Because there is a direct relationship between the two. So this is the kind of thinking that, in discussion, that I'm having with other people, right? And I don't know if I'm, yeah? Yes.
It very much makes sense to me when you say that a new common is about restructuring social relationships. And I would sort of want to speak to that at an almost theoretical level, because language is the main means which we create social relationships, think about social relationships, and communicate on new commons. And in taking into account the fact that the ontology of capitalism, colonialism, required a very specific language, not a language of Spanish or French, but a language on an epistemological level, how do we begin to create a new commons by not falling into these pitfalls of language? For example, the Occupy movement came up with this notion of the 99%. Well, that's a big language pitfall, because when you look at it, it's not 99%. The idea was there, but how do we begin to negotiate that language and reconstructing our ontology, which is a new commons, through language which is so entangled in every colonialistic process?
Well, maybe I begin, this is my materialism, you know, I think that the struggle produces the language. You know, I think that it's the struggle, it's difficult to change the language to change the struggle. It's more than the struggle, they come together. It's part of, you know, so for all the limits of the 99%, right? But I think it had a certain sparkle of the imagination, right? But of course, very limited, and I agree that you know, we need new words and commons too now. In fact, there is a whole set of words. This is a very important issue in a way. You know, democracy, commons, right? These, for example, are now a terrain, a contested terrain. Should we throw away democracy? Well, there's so much reason, so many reasons for doing that, right? It's probably one of the most contaminated words in our political vocabulary. On the other hand, as soon as you find another one, forget about democracy, let's have the commons. Within 5 years, the commons have already been taken over. There is now a whole political spectrum, beginning with the World Bank. The notion of a global common, which is an abomination. There's no such a thing as global commons. The only people now who are the global commons are the corporations, who are the World Banks, right, who use the notion of the global commons in order to be able to privatize the world and say, oh, we'll save it for you. We'll save it. By privatizing it, we'll save it. Yeah? So that's the global common. But the problem is that as soon as you say, okay, I'm not going to use commons, I'm not going to use democracy, because these are, you're basically continuously retreating. In a way, you're allowing all the things, the concept, that at one point. And so I see the dilemma, but I also begin to feel refusal of allowing them to use concepts that also have attached histories. They have attached, in our collective radical imagination, they have, sparkled, bring back so many memories to give them up, right? So but that's very important. Language is a big issue, definitely. Another question? Common criticism? Yes.
I'm thinking about the language you used more tonight, I guess, in a little bit talking about the word commons as a particularly mobilizing word for a particular form of struggle. And I'm wondering what kind of difference you find between that and, say, communism as a mobilizing word. Because from my understanding, too, things I most associate with commons, have already been described, like Marx onwards, like talking about the enclosures or not. Marx didn't talk about moving back into those commons in England in the whatever century, communism was a particular social movement passing beyond those commons and past those enclosures. So I'm wondering what you see as a difference or going past of communism to return to the word enclosure.
Well, communism, that's another, again, communism is another big word, but communism in the Marxist tradition and socialist tradition is state-based, right? And of course, eventually the state withers away. So the commons, I guess, is when the state has withered away, but the state has had the peculiarity of resisting its withering away. And so it's better to just not start with the state, because we never know if once you start with the state, it will never wither away. So I think that's one first difference. The other difference, which I think is very important, and this may be also connect again with your question, has to do, I take a lot from Marx, and I've learned a lot, and I use it, and so on. On the other hand, there are certain lines that I've drawn in my, debt to Marxism, which is, I very much object to the idea that communism, basically, capitalism has been a stepping stone for the advent of communism, for the advent of a non-class society, non-exploited. That you need to have, for example, large-scale industry in order to liberate labor as a creative activity. I don't agree with that for the very reason that technology is not just a set of machines, of material things that you can just take over and transport. It's like with the state, right? The state is not just a machine that you can take from the capitalist system, take it and plant it into, an aggressive system, and then it becomes good, right? And the same way, imagine, for example, a future liberated society, managing cooperatively nuclear plants. No, because nuclear plants are deadly, and they will remain deadly, and they will in fact be undemocratic. Not only deadly, but also undemocratic in the kind of social organization that they require. No matter what society you plant them, right? So those two differences are very important. I think there's still a technologism in Marx. That, I'm not against technology. Technology has always existed, right, in a sense of instruments and so forth. But capitalist technology is also something different, that has been always devised and developed with an antagonistic goal in mind, right, with the idea of de-skilling people, with the idea of defeating certain forms of organization, right? So it's a technology that has built within itself a program, a very political and perverse program, antagonistic program. So that I don't think we should re-ruralize the world, but certainly create a very, very different relationship to the rural world, to the land, to the, which is, the Native American people of our continent said that you have to leave the earth good for the next 7 generations, right? It's not even good for us. Let's imagine that we have a revolution, right? The idea, everybody ideal of revolution tonight, okay? Well, for the next 100 years, we'll have to spend them. I mean, this is not a topic against the revolution, but we'll have to spend it cleaning the earth. It's so booby-trapped today that wherever you turn, at the rate we are living now, right, by the time the next generation of children will be of age, right, you will not be able to swim in the seas if we continue this way, because the seas will be radioactive or will be using petroleum. Already, most waterways are impossible. On the positive side, people are beginning to do something about it. There is a Great Lake Commons initiative. I don't know if you're aware of it. In Ontario, there is a coalition of people have come together to clean and care for the Great Lakes. Because the Great Lakes have been so degraded, they are now pools of whatever. And so there is a broad coalition of people. In fact, I have clippings in my bag about the Great Lake Initiative that you may be interested in, because you're not, the Native American, the whole coalition of groups have come together and they are now discussing they're looking at the Great Lakes as a common. And what responsibility the people who live in the area have towards them. And what, danger there is in allowing what is happening now, which is their increasing destruction. So they become sterile areas, where the fishes are dead, or they're so polluted you cannot touch them, you will not think of eating them. And, they exhale all kinds of noxious substances that go into the rains, etc. So that's I think yeah.
I have a question. Thank you. I read Something in the Witch, and it's really enlightening for me. I hope to read this book. I have a question about making babies. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and it's not something so popular in my queer community. And I like to think about reproduction as a space of struggle, and keeping that in mind, what is your position on biological reproduction, so making babies, and can it be a place of struggle too?
Oh, absolutely. It has to be a place of struggle. I mean, it has to be a place. It's one, I've not mentioned it tonight because there were so many other things, and also I wanted to talk about that on Sunday, talking about much more about, particularly in terms of reproduction, in terms of also procreation, child raising, care work, and to go much more in detail, sex work, right? But there are many struggles, and not just the struggle around abortion, for instance, but this is another war that is being waged on women, throughout the last 30 years. Because we have seen, for instance, that the attack on the means of reproduction, Africa, Asia, everywhere, has come with, for example, the attempt to sterilize women on a mass scale. in many of the countries that I mentioned, right? That, and also if not sterilized, there's a lot to be said, also produce contraceptives that the World Bank has dispersed all over the world to, contraceptives that women cannot control, like Northland, intrauterine devices, there's the spiral and so on, that you cannot, only a doctor can take out. And so even if you realize they damage it. So that was one kind of, this massive attack on women as being the cause of poverty into the world. It's very interesting. The World Bank has always uses women as being the cause of poverty in the world. They produce too many children, their subsistence, they're backward, they work with the hoe, they are subsistence farmers, the land is not productive, the land should be brought to the bank, and you should set up a monetary activity with the money that you can get by using your land as a collateral. Anyway, so today, international agencies and government have a different kind of policies, right? But I think it's pretty much the same position. So for example, today, there's a whole attack coming particularly from the right against, for example, Planned Parenthood and so on. I don't think there is a big difference. I think that in the 80s, they were attacking population control, population explosion, because they were confronting what they perceived as an upsurge of demand, an upsurge of demand for a redistribution of wealth in the world. They were confronting a world of struggle. And I interpret that all attack, that all scale population explosion, and the sterilization of women and so on, it's really a political maneuver to basically say it's not that there is an unjust distribution of wealth in the world, but it's that there are too many people. So you are the culprit, right? Today, that danger has been minimized. The warfare machine, so many other forms of attack have been put into place that danger of world insurgency is not there in the same way. This is my interpretation. In either case, the issue is not how many, but who is going to be allowed to reproduce, who is not going to be allowed to reproduce. So the question is not how many, right? But it's the question of who decides, who is going to be reproduced, under what conditions. And I think that the capitalist class today, as at the time of the witch hunt, wants to have the control of the uterus. They want to have the control of women's bodies, because they see a direct connection, and they want to see a direct connection between women's bodies and the labor market, women's body and the capacity to work. So that is there. And, and in particular also, the fact that women reproduce the next generation of people, right, is also connected to the fact that they can also reproduce people as submissive, as subordinate, as docile workers, or can they reproduce them as people in struggle? Right? And so the whole issue of control over procreation, as a very important political dimension that we should always keep in mind. Right? This is to look at it from a global perspective. Right? So the question of is not just the issue of abortion, it's the issue of who decides today, right? Who comes into the world? In whose hands is that decision? Right? Today, for example, in the United States, in fact, there was a report that came out on January 15 by two women working with a journal called Health, Politics, and Law. And they said, this is their words, that if you're poor, low income, or black, or part of some other minority, and you get pregnant today, getting pregnant in those circumstances puts you, that's their word, puts you outside of constitutional boundaries. What do they mean? They mean that, for instance, if you're pregnant and you are poor or you're black, and say you have a car accident, and the police comes and you tell them, I'm pregnant, you will be arrested because you put in jeopardy the life of the fetus, right? And that they have collected a number of cases in which poor women, for no reason, for reason that they would never have come up as a source of arrest, if the woman was well-to-do, have actually been arrested. And there are now at least 30 states that are listing, yeah, they are making a list of conditions for which you can be incriminated, right, if you're pregnant, for behavior. Let's say you've been drinking too much, you have been using drugs. There are women now in the US who are accused of murder because as pregnant they used drugs. And then in one case the child was born dead, and the doctor said there's no connection between the use of drugs and the death of the child. Nevertheless, the woman is accused of murder. It's been a policy of trying to control, right, the process of procreation with surrogacy, right? And basically more and more seeing women, casting women as wombs, right? Casting women as reproductive machines, right? That you may decide, no, you don't reproduce anymore, and you sterilize them, but you want to have control over that process. And even all the research, in vitro fertilization, etc., etc. I know there's a big debate in the women's movement, but as I said, I'm not against technology, but I'm concerned about the type of program that I see. Now, the other side of practice has to do also with the whole organization of childbirth and with the organization of child raising, right? Childbirth today is an assembly line. There's a big debate again about, these movements for a different type of childhood. Some feminists see them as bourgeois. It's really a luxury to want to give birth. But the reality is that if you go to a hospital today, right, you are on an assembly line. They give you 2 hours to deliver. You don't deliver in your 2 hours, then it's a cesarean cut, right? Yeah, and you are in a situation of really helplessness. So the idea that each body is unique and you have your own timing, no. There is an industrial time, and you have to produce the child in those 2 hours, otherwise you can. The same way now, there's a lot of cesarean cuts, and the same area also, the whole issue of exportation of the uterus, right? There is now an inflation of women who are losing their uterus, but for the reasons that absolutely do not justify that, right? Basically, but in the way doctors are making the medical profession now, it's really making a big. So my sense is that there is a big struggle there to be organized. And when we have children, we need to understand that, first of all, it's now a highly political, it's an experience that exposes you to a lot of dangers. also, secondly, that our responsibility to these children are bigger than ever, because they're entering the world, you know, that is so hostile to them, very, very hostile to them. You know, one of the work that I'm trying to do now is to basically write about children in capitalism, and particularly children today. There is really a war against children. The way they are closing the public schools, they are continuously limiting. The schools are becoming prisons, right? I don't know if you followed the debates in the United States after the shooting of the school in Connecticut, the school called Sandy, right, at the Sandy, the village. But, so there's a whole set of people who want to introduce more cops into the schools. They want to arm the teacher. They want to put cops with arms. Right? They also want to introduce psychiatrists, because instead of facing, you know, what is going on, why we have so much violence in that country, why every day there is a shootout, why the schools have become a place of danger for children, instead of really looking into the causes, right? They're now, you know, blaming the children. Well, we have to understand more quickly, you know, the mental problems that they are developing. Why they're developing? So now they're going to have psychiatrists, cops, arms. Oh, this is one major threat. And, I don't know about what's happening also here in about children, but in the schools of the US, there is now mass distribution of Ritalin and other drugs, because almost every child is being, you know, they have an attention deficit. The schools are so bad, the children have attention deficit because they're bored still, or because they're lying. They now are discovering, actually in some of the more recent studies, there's some good soul has done. They have discovered that a lot of attention deficit comes from hunger. There's a lot of children in the United States who, they did these interviews, and they said that they cannot pay attention because they're hungry. So the last figures were 50 million people that suffer hunger in the country. Now that's quite a number in the so-called richest country in the world. Right? So the Ritalin is distributed. Right? You have a teacher with a bottle, right? And then one to you, flip the tongue. Let's make sure that you don't spit it out. Flip the tongue, right? So what happens to you over the long run with all this, right? But every child now is an attention deficit. So this when we speak of children, and by the way, we have to speak of children. I'm glad you brought up that issue, because children don't exist in the political literature of the left. Yeah.
Who wants to bring it back? Like,
Yeah.
who wants to raise a kid in a community that is like going to prison all the time? That,
Yeah. And they're doing, 5, 6 years old, they're doing all the tests, the attitude test. They're doing all these tests to see, kind of attitude you have. So these poor kids are being really denied their childhood.
Yeah. One thing that seemed important to me, what we were saying in the talk earlier, was that even though struggles, like mass struggles against cuts to services and struggles in defense of land are different, they're against a similar type of attack or similar process. And here in Quebec, around the same time that the Quebec government announced that it was going to increase tuition, it also announced that it was the plan law for the development of mines and dams and other mega projects on Indigenous territories to the north. And so I was wondering, and there were struggles within the student movement about how to relate to that type of exploitation of the land in indigenous territories. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on, based on that analysis that brings these things together, on solidarity between these struggles of peoples in very different positions in relation to these attacks.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we see the continuity of the struggle. First of all, the struggle around knowledge is very connected with the struggle around land. In fact, we have learned that from the Native American people. They've always said that when you lose the land, you lose much more than a source of material sustenance. You're losing a culture, you're losing knowledge, you're losing your soul, right? So when we hear of another forest that has been destroyed, we are hearing about the whole world of knowledge that we are losing, right? And so ideally, I think that the horizon my horizon, it's a kind of struggle where we can actually bring these different worlds together to support each other, right? Where, for example, the urban gardeners, the urban farmers, now we have urban farmers too, and we'll support the struggle, I don't know, of women on strike, students on strike. We'll provide food so that the students can continue there, or feed the women on strike at Walmart, and the Commons clinics. There's now an attempt in the US to create health commons. So many people don't have health here. So basically doctors, nurses coming together. The nurses have been very great. They have been joining, they've been present in many occupations. They work with a lot of occupied, even now. By the way, and so to bring them together and have them begin to share experience and also material support, that is what is to be built. But I want to show some things before we go that I brought here. Okay, where to start? First of all, these are news from the debtors movement, anti-debt movement that is beginning to build in the US. There is an organization in New York called Strike Debt. They grew out of Occupy, but Strike Debt began as students against loans, against indebtment, but now it's much broader. And this is a very good handbook. You can find it on PDF online, and it's going to come out also as there's a new edition that is in the making. But it's very interesting. Go online and find it. I think it's called Strike Debt. If you go to strikedebt.org, you will find all the references. It's very good. It speaks about the whole debt economy. I haven't talked about that tonight. But that's another part of the story, connected to land expropriation and all the rest. And it's a very important struggle, because when you are in debt, that is a very isolating type of relationship. It's a very deceptive type of relationship to capital, because you don't see any longer the exploitation, right? If you're fighting on a particular job, you know you're being exploited. But when you're in debt to a bank, somehow the relation of exploitation, and yet there is exploitation. The fact that you have a debt means that you have to take every job, no matter what, right? But you don't see any longer who's controlling your work. It's also very isolating, because you think it's my failure. It's you and the bank. You're not part of a collectivity, right? If you are, in a job, you're part of a whole group. Whereas, okay. So this is very useful. Look, every type of that gives you some practical suggestion, but also a perspective on this spreading that economy. This is the title. It comes out of the Occupy movement, which is still in New York. This is all New York. Is still alive. There is no occupation, but there are many working groups that are going on. By the way, if you go to the Strike That website, you will also find about the Rolling Jubilee, which is a very interesting initiative. I cannot go into it now because it will take some time, but maybe on Sunday I'll talk about it. And also they're setting up a clinic, a health clinic. Clinic means that you have a group of nurses and doctors who come together at an appointed time and work for free. That's what the clinic means. So Tidal comes out of the Occupy movement that is still very much alive. And one of the things that has been very inspiring has been what they call Occupy Sending. I could have used it as an example after Fukushima. You know, Occupy Sandy was the hurricane, and entire areas of of New York, those closest to the beaches in the poorest areas, were left abandoned by the authorities for days, for weeks. You know, people were in the dark, in the cold, without food, without medicine, and so it was community people and also people from the Occupy movement who went and organized some relief. And some are still there, in Red Hook and so on. This comes out and basically speaks stories from the Occupy movement. And this one I brought for memory's sake, but also speaking about these wages for students is something that that was published by a group of people. You know, probably you know the journal Midnight Notes. This was a radical journal that does not exist anymore. And they created this very beautiful little piece that you can also find online. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. It's called Wages for Students, and it's very, very funny, but very prophetic. Because it really speaks to trends that were beginning to be seen in that period, which had fully developed. Now we have seen, we are gone through them, and you know, that whole enclosure of knowledge, and that whole, you know, basically takeover of the schools. So, and this is very important to remember also, the question of wages for students, because, you know, today, and I want to talk about it more on Sunday, you know, today we are continuously told that health is our responsibility, education is our responsibility, retirement pensions is our responsibility. Why? Because we are the only beneficiary of education. We are only beneficiary of our health, etc. Whereas we know that we educate ourselves, we go to get a degree, to get a certificate, not only because we want our personal development and growth, but also because these days you cannot find a job unless you have now a piece of paper, or at least you have some better hope of finding an employment. Right? So it's very important to remember that the notion of the student as a worker, because when you see yourself as a worker, it's also seeing that education is not again a personal choice, but is also something which we are channeled with the prospect of starvation if we don't engage into this kind of activity, right? And I think there was a time in which this was more recognized. Whereas the whole neoliberal ideology has been to say, no, we don't owe you anything. We don't owe you anything, right? Basically, all that you do is to your own advantage, this idea of, we are these little islands. And so, wages for students, and I think you'll also find it very entertaining. So, thanks to you for listening to me for so long. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.